For 200 years, Bellweather's village clock had never lost a minute. Then it began running 7 minutes slow, and behind its eastern face the elderly clockmaker found a map no living villager had ever seen. It showed lanes that had vanished long ago, 12 symbols arranged like the hours on a dial, and one faded instruction: when Bellweather has forgotten, follow the hours home. What had the clock been keeping secret, and why had it waited 2 centuries to reveal it? Welcome to Grandma's Sleep Stories, where gentle mysteries and comforting tales are told slowly and softly. So make yourself comfortable, let the day grow quiet, and join us in a small English village of honey-coloured stone and softly glowing windows. This is the map hidden inside the village clock. Bellweather sat in a shallow fold of the English countryside, where the green hills lowered themselves gently towards a narrow river, and the lanes arrived one at a time, as though none of them wished to disturb the village all at once. At the centre of it stood the market square. It was not a grand square, but it was a handsome one, paved with worn grey stones and surrounded by buildings the colour of warm toast. There was a bakery with steamed windows, a grocer whose striped awning had faded almost white, a small library that had once been a schoolroom, and, between the post office and the tea shop, a clockmaker's shop with the name T.W. Wren painted in gold upon the glass. Above them all rose the clock tower. Thomas Wren had known its sound for 78 years. He had heard it through the open bedroom window as a boy, from the playground behind the church, and later from the narrow workbench where his father taught him how to hold a screwdriver without forcing it. Even after Thomas married Margaret and moved to the cottage beside Mill Lane, the chimes still reached him, softened by distance and the leaves of the chestnut trees. Now Margaret had been gone for 6 winters, and Thomas lived above the shop once more. The clock marked the beginning and ending of his days with a regularity he found comforting. At 7 he opened the curtains. At 8 he unlocked the shop. At 10 Mrs. Price from the bakery brought him a currant bun in a paper bag, although he had never once asked her to do so. It was Mrs. Price who first complained that the village clock was slow. 7 minutes, she said, placing the paper bag on his counter. My rolls were out before the quarter bell, and they are never out before the quarter bell. Thomas looked at the regulator clock on his wall, then through the window at the tower. Perhaps your rolls have become unusually efficient. Mrs. Price gave him the patient look of someone who had known him too long to be diverted. By lunchtime, 3 other people had mentioned it. The post van arrived while the clock still claimed it was 20 to 1. The grocer closed for lunch before the hour. Ruth Merriweather, who kept the library, came in carrying her little silver watch and announced that Bellweather was officially 7 minutes behind the rest of the country. Thomas promised to inspect the mechanism the following morning. That evening he stood outside his shop after turning the sign to closed. A fine October mist had gathered above the square. The clock's 4 faces shone pale against the darkening stone, and when it struck 6 the sound seemed as steady as ever. Yet Thomas noticed something between the 3rd and 4th chimes, a faint hesitation, no longer than a breath. The old clock, it appeared, was trying to remember something.
The tower door stood beside the old town hall, beneath an arch so low that Thomas had to remove his hat before stepping through it. He arrived shortly after 8 the next morning, with a leather tool case in one hand and a ring of keys in the other. Samuel Beck, the village caretaker, was waiting inside. "Stairs are dry," Samuel said. "Pigeons are offended, but otherwise all is well." Thomas thanked him and began to climb. There were 93 steps to the clock room. Thomas knew because he had counted them on every visit since his apprenticeship, although he had never decided whether the small landing halfway should be included. The steps turned tightly within the tower, passing arrow-slit windows through which he caught brief views of chimneys, tiled roofs, and the river shining beyond the allotments. The clock room smelled of timber, cold stone, and machine oil. At its centre stood the movement, a patient arrangement of iron wheels, brass bearings, and rods that travelled outward to the 4 faces. The mechanism had been altered over the years, but its oldest parts remained. On the main frame, beneath layers of darkened lacquer, the date 1826 could still be read. Thomas set down his case and listened. Tick. The escapement released. Tock. The weight descended by a fraction. For several minutes nothing seemed wrong. Then came the hesitation he had heard from the square, a tiny resistance in the drive towards the eastern face. Thomas followed the rod to a wooden access panel. 2 screws had worked loose, allowing the panel to shift against the gearing. It was an ordinary fault, the sort that could be repaired before Mrs. Price's next tray of rolls was ready. He removed the first screw, then the second. The panel came away with a soft sigh of dust. Something pale moved behind it. Thomas reached carefully into the narrow space and drew out a folded sheet of thick paper. It had been placed in a shallow recess in the stone, safely beyond the reach of the gears. A blue thread was wound around it 3 times and tied in a small, neat bow. He remained very still. The dust upon the paper was old and even. No modern hand had pushed it there during recent repairs. Thomas carried it to the window ledge where the morning light was strongest and eased the thread aside without breaking it. Inside was a map. Bellweather's river curved across the page, but several unfamiliar lanes wandered beside it. 12 small drawings surrounded the village, a loaf, a key, a book, a sheaf of wheat, a bell, and other symbols, each occupying the position of an hour upon a clock. At the bottom, in faded brown ink, someone had written, "When Bellweather has forgotten, follow the hours home." Thomas read the sentence twice. Then the clock behind him stopped. The silence of a stopped clock is unlike any other silence.
It does not simply fill a room, it seems to wait there, expecting the missing sound to return. Thomas turned from the map and crossed to the mechanism. The pendulum had come to rest a little left of centre. He checked the escapement, lifted the drive slightly, and found the cause almost at once. In removing the warped access panel, he had allowed the eastern rod to settle out of alignment. He corrected it, gave the pendulum one measured push, and listened as the tower found its rhythm again. Tick, tock, tick, tock. Only then did Thomas return to the map. He laid it flat on a clean square of cotton. The paper was made from rag rather than wood pulp, and its edges had been cut by hand. The ink had faded, but the lines remained remarkably clear. Whoever drew it had known Bellweather intimately. The curve of the river was exact, so were the church, the bridge, and the market cross. Yet a lane marked Clockmaker's Walk ran east from the square through a row of buildings that no longer existed. Beyond them, where the modern map showed only gardens and a strip of neglected ground, the old map contained a circle of 12 apple trees. Thomas examined the symbols around the border. Each had a tiny number beside it, beginning with the loaf at 1 and ending with a small open hand at 12. A dotted path connected them, but portions of it had faded away. On the reverse was a second message. For the keeper of the clock when its 2nd century is complete. Thomas sat down on the wooden stool. Its 2nd century complete, 200 years. The clock had been completed in 1826, and the present year marked precisely its bicentenary. He thought of all the repairs made during that time. Gears had been replaced, the faces had been repainted, electric winding motors had been installed in the 1960s, then removed when the village chose to restore the weights. Dozens of clockmakers must have opened the same panels, yet the folded map had remained in its recess. Perhaps they had not needed to remove that particular piece of wood. Perhaps the loosened screws and the 7 missing minutes had been coincidence. Thomas had spent his life repairing mechanisms and had little use for claims that clocks chose their moments. Still, he handled the map with particular care. He completed the repair, reset the hands, and waited through a full quarter hour. At 9:30, the bell rang exactly when it should. Thomas folded the map along its original creases, wrapped it in the cotton, and placed it inside his tool case. There was only one person in Bellweather he wished to show it to. Ruth Merriweather would be at the library by 10, and she knew where the village kept its forgotten things.
Bellweather Library had once contained 2 classrooms, although one of them was now filled with shelves, and the other with shelves that Ruth Merriweather insisted were merely waiting to be organized. Ruth had been the village librarian for 36 years. She wore her silver hair in a loose knot, kept a pencil tucked behind her left ear, and could locate a book that had been returned to the wrong shelf by noticing what she called a disturbance in the colour of the spines. When Thomas entered, she was arranging a display of gardening books beneath a paper sign that read "Autumn Jobs." "The clock is correct again," he told her. Then the rest of us may continue. I was afraid Thursday might have to wait." Thomas placed his tool case on the long oak table. "I found something." She saw from his expression that it was not a broken screw. Together they unfolded the map beneath the reading lamp. Ruth did not touch it immediately. She bent close, studying the handwriting, paper, and faded symbols before looking up at Thomas. Where was it? Behind the eastern face. And nobody has found it before? Not according to the maintenance records. Ruth read both inscriptions, then removed the pencil from behind her ear and began writing notes on a separate sheet. "Rag paper," she murmured. "Iron gall ink, I should think. Early 19th century is certainly possible. And this is the old mill bridge before the parapet was rebuilt. Look at the shape of it." She pointed to the first symbol, the little loaf. "Mrs. Price's bakery stands on the site of an older bakehouse. There has been bread made there since at least 1780. 1 o'clock, Thomas said. The first hour." Ruth disappeared between the shelves and returned carrying a flat archival box. From it she removed a copy of the village enclosure map of 1831. The two maps were similar but not identical. Clockmaker's Walk appeared on the older drawing and ended at a small rectangle labelled Vale's Garden. On the later map, the name had vanished. Ruth found a trade directory from 1828. "Here," she said, "Elias Vale, horologist and maker of the Bellweather public clock. Workshop, Clockmaker's Walk." Thomas knew the name. Elias Vale's mark was stamped beneath the clock's main frame, although village histories mentioned him only briefly. The tower itself was usually credited to Sir Matthew Bellweather, who paid for the stonework. In the official anniversary booklet prepared 25 years earlier, Elias occupied only a single sentence beneath a photograph of the tower. Ruth continued down the page. Lydia Vale, stationer and teacher, same address, possibly his wife or his sister. Outside, the newly corrected clock struck 10. Ruth looked towards the sound, then back at the 12 symbols. "I suppose," she said with the faintest smile, "we had better begin with the loaf." Mrs. Price listened to their explanation while dusting flour from her hands. Her family had owned the bakery for 4 generations, and she regarded any occurrence involving the building as something in which she was naturally entitled to participate. "A map inside the clock," she said, "and the first mark is here?" "That is our suspicion," Ruth replied. "You may suspect wherever you like, provided you do it before the lunchtime rush." She led them through the warm bakery, past racks of cooling rolls and loaves with shining brown crusts. The air smelled of yeast, cinnamon, and the deep, comforting warmth of ovens that had been lit before sunrise. The oldest part of the building was the cellar. Its steps dipped below the square, and the walls were made from larger stones than those above.
Mrs. Price switched on a bare bulb, but Ruth asked her to wait before going farther. On the map, the loaf was drawn beside 3 short lines that Thomas had first taken for decoration. Down in the cellar, those lines made sense. They represented the 3 low arches supporting the original bakehouse floor. They examined the first arch and found only lime wash. The second contained a small recess filled with empty preserve jars. On the centre stone of the third was a carving no larger than a penny, a round loaf crossed by a single line. 1, Thomas said. Beneath the carving, almost hidden by whitewash, were several letters. Ruth dampened a cloth and wiped the stone with great care. A short inscription emerged. M. Price, bread for the raising. Mrs. Price stopped smiling. Price? Ruth consulted the trade directory. Martha Price, baker, this building, 1828. My great-great-great-grandfather always said the family arrived later than that, Mrs. Price murmured. Perhaps he was mistaken. Thomas studied the words. Bread for the raising. Raising the tower. Or raising money, suggested Ruth. Mrs. Price climbed onto a wooden stool and reached behind a disused shelf beneath the carved stone. Her fingers found a shallow groove. From it she drew a small brass disc, green with age around its edge. One side bore the same loaf symbol. On the other was the Roman numeral I. They carried it upstairs and laid it on the flour-dusted counter. Mrs. Price polished it gently with the corner of her apron until the loaf shone. Before they left, she wrapped 3 still warm buns in paper and refused payment. If Martha Price provided bread for the raising, the least I can do is provide buns for the finding. Back in the square, Thomas held the brass disc against the map. It fitted perfectly over the first symbol. The dotted path continued from the loaf towards a tiny drawing of an open book. Ruth looked across the square at the library. It appears that the second hour has been waiting for us all morning.
The library's oldest wall belonged to the schoolhouse that had stood there before it. Ruth knew this because a change in the stonework ran from floor to ceiling behind the local history shelves, marking the place where 2 small classrooms had once been joined. The second symbol on the map was an open book with a sprig of something tucked between its pages. Beside it were 4 dots arranged in a square. 4 windows, Ruth said, looking at an engraving of the old school. The original room had 4 windows. Only 2 remain. They moved a revolving rack of postcards and found the outline of a blocked window behind it. The stone sill was still present, hidden beneath a polished wooden ledge on which Ruth usually displayed new novels. Thomas ran his fingers underneath. There is something carved here. They knelt, which took them both rather longer than it once would have done, and looked up at the underside of the sill. A little open book had been cut into the wood.
beneath it were the words, L. Vale, letters for the raising. "Lydia," Ruth said softly. The shelf below contained several volumes that had belonged to the original school. Ruth removed them one at a time. Behind the final book was a narrow wooden compartment with a brass catch. Inside lay a second disc marked with an open book and the numeral 2. There was also a folded slip of paper. Unlike the map, it was only a copy, made in Ruth's own handwriting many years earlier. She unfolded it and began to laugh. I had forgotten this entirely. The note recorded a line from an 1826 school account book that had since been sent to the county archive. Paper supplied to Mr. Vale, 12 large sheets, no charge. Lydia Vale was the schoolmistress, Ruth said. She donated the paper. Perhaps she drew the map as well. Thomas placed the second disc beside the first. The two pieces were the same size, but the symbols were engraved by different hands. The loaf was broad and slightly uneven. The book had fine lines upon its open pages. 12 villagers, he said, 12 contributions, and 12 places where they left their marks. Ruth turned the map clockwise. The third symbol was a key, positioned near the old town hall. Before they could consider it, the library door opened and Mrs. Price came in, still wearing her flowery apron. "Well?" Ruth showed her the disc. Mrs. Price nodded with satisfaction, as if she had personally expected nothing less from the building opposite. By midday, the news had travelled from the bakery to the post office, crossed the square and reached the tea shop. Bellweather might follow all 12 clues before he and Ruth had time to eat their buns. So they agreed to keep the remaining destinations private for a little while. Some mysteries, Ruth said, were best allowed to unfold at the pace of an old clock.
The key on the map did not point towards a locksmith. Bellweather had not had one since 1947, when Mr. Cooper retired and turned his shop into a tobacconist's. Instead, the dotted line ended at the old town hall, a modest Georgian building beside the tower. Its ground floor contained the parish offices, while the upper room was used for council meetings, flower arranging classes, and once a month an energetic gathering devoted to Scottish dancing. Samuel Beck met Thomas and Ruth at the door. "Mrs. Price says you have found 2 pieces of a clockmaker's treasure," he said. "Mrs. Price has embroidered the facts," Thomas replied. They showed him the map, and Samuel became helpfully serious. He unlocked a cupboard containing the building's old plans and brought out a ring of keys large enough to anchor a small boat. The map's key symbol lay beside a little square with a diagonal cross. After some searching, Ruth recognized it on an 1840 plan as the strong room where rents and parish records had once been kept. The room was now a stationery cupboard. Boxes of envelopes, spare light bulbs, and folded polling booths had to be removed before they could see the back wall. There, set into the stone, was a small iron door painted the same cream colour as the plaster.
Samuel tried 17 keys before one turned. The door opened onto a shallow recess. It contained no money and no ancient documents, only a brass disc marked 3 and a wooden tally worn smooth at one end. Carved into the recess were the words, J. Cooper, iron for the raising. The locksmith, Ruth said, or his ancestor. The trade directory confirmed that John Cooper had worked as a blacksmith on the northern edge of the village. A parish account recorded his repair of gate hinges and horseshoes, but nothing about the clock. Thomas held the tally to the light. 6 small notches ran along one side and 6 along the other. 12 again, Samuel observed. On its reverse, faint letters spelled, "One hand alone cannot lift the hour." They stood quietly in the stationery cupboard while footsteps crossed the office outside. The sentence was not grand, yet it seemed to settle naturally beside what they had found. Martha Price had provided bread, Lydia Vale had supplied paper, John Cooper had given iron. Not treasure, Thomas thought, a record. But why hide it? As they replaced the boxes, Samuel remembered something. In the tower storeroom was an old iron bracket removed during repairs in 1912. He fetched it and showed Thomas the maker's mark, J.C., surrounding a tiny key. Part of John Cooper's work had remained inside the clock for 2 centuries, even after the village forgot his name. The 4th symbol on the map was a sheaf of wheat. Its dotted path led beyond the square, along the river, towards a field that had not grown wheat in living memory.
The afternoon had become mild and pale, with sunlight showing through the clouds in broad, quiet patches. Thomas and Ruth followed the river path past the allotments, carrying the map inside its cotton wrapping and the 3 brass discs in Thomas's coat pocket. At the edge of Bellweather stood Mill Meadow. Children played there in summer, and sheep sometimes appeared in winter when the grass needed keeping short. The old water mill had vanished after a fire in 1889, but its mill stream remained, moving beneath willow branches before returning to the river. The map showed the sheaf of wheat beside the mill. They found the foundations easily. Low stones made a rectangle in the grass, and part of the mill race still passed through a mossy arch. Ruth searched the bank, while Thomas examined the surviving wall. Near the waterline, the shape of a wheat sheaf had been carved into a broad stone. The inscription below it was partly worn away. E. Brown, oak for the raising. Oak, said Thomas, not wheat. The miller would have had timber for gears, chutes, and repairs. They looked around for the 4th disc, but the river had flooded the foundations many times. There was no cupboard, shelf, or hidden recess, only stones, nettles, and the patient sound of water. Thomas felt along the carved block. The upper edge moved beneath his hand. Together they lifted a narrow capstone. Beneath it lay a little lead box sealed with wax. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, was the brass disc marked IV.
It was as bright as if it had been placed there only yesterday. With it was a curl of dark wood. Thomas recognized old oak, close-grained and hard. On one side, someone had drawn a tiny tooth from a gear. "There are wooden components in the striking train," he said. "Most people imagine an old clock is entirely metal, but oak can absorb shock more gently. This may have been a pattern piece." They sat on the foundation wall and ate the buns Mrs. Price had given them. The river moved slowly below, carrying 3 yellow leaves beneath the arch. Across the meadow, the tower rose above Bellweather, its clock faces small and white in the distance. At 3, the bell reached them a moment after they saw the hands align. 4 people remembered, 8 remain. Thomas looked at the map. The 5th symbol appeared to be a spool of thread placed beside cottages once occupied by weavers. The 6th was a bell near the church. Beyond that, the dotted line grew faint. He wondered whether the clues had been intended for them to find every disc or simply to understand what the symbols meant. Then Ruth noticed something written inside the curl of oak. Thomas turned it carefully to the light. There were only 5 words. "The hours will open the garden."
Rain came to Bellweather during the night and remained through most of the following day. It tapped softly against the clockmaker's shop window, silvering the square and deepening the colour of the roofs. Thomas placed a green baize cloth across his workbench and arranged the map, 4 brass discs, a wooden tally, and a curl of oak upon it. The shop's clocks continued around him in their separate voices. A carriage clock ticked briskly. A long case clock breathed more slowly. From the wall came the delicate whir of a cuckoo preparing to appear, although Thomas had temporarily wrapped its little door with ribbon so it would not interrupt his thoughts. Ruth arrived carrying the trade directory and 2 cups of tea beneath a covered tray. The 5th mark belonged to a weaver named Anne Moss, she said. Her cottage was demolished when Church Street was widened. The 6th appears to be Robert Bell, who helped recast the church bell in 1819. Their hiding places may be gone, but perhaps their names are not. They searched parish records, copied inscriptions, and compared old plans. By mid-afternoon, they had identified 9 of the 12 symbols. Anne Moss had given woolen cord. Robert Bell had supplied a pulley. George Finch, represented by a feather, had written notices asking for subscriptions. Sarah Green, whose mark was a lantern, had provided candles so Elias Vale could work after dusk. William Hart, a carter, had transported stone without charge. Each contribution was modest. Together they had made the clock possible. Yet none of those names appeared on the brass plaque in the tower vestibule. It read only, "Erected through the generosity of Sir Matthew Bellweather, 1826. Sir Matthew had paid for the tower, which was generous, but the clock within it had been raised by the village. Ruth drew a circle on a clean sheet and placed the contributors at their corresponding hours. The incomplete names formed an almost unbroken ring.
The hours will open the garden, Vale's garden, perhaps. The map showed its 12 apple trees, but modern property plans divided the area among back gardens and a neglected strip behind a terrace of cottages. They turned to the dotted route. When Ruth traced it from symbol to symbol, it formed a shape resembling the outline of a key. The key's teeth ended at the old garden. Its round bow surrounded the market square. Thomas placed the 4 brass discs on their printed symbols. Small notches in their edges aligned with the dotted route. "They are not simply markers," he said. "They are parts of something." Each disc contained a narrow slot near its rim. If all 12 were overlapped in the proper order, Thomas suspected those slots might reveal a word, a direction, or perhaps the shape of a key. Outside, the clock struck 4 through the rain. At the final chime, the shop door opened and Edith Moss entered beneath a dripping umbrella. She was 91, and she had come because Mrs. Price had told her that Thomas was looking for a garden everyone else had forgotten.
Edith Moss accepted tea, removed her raincoat, and sat in the chair Thomas usually reserved for customers waiting while he changed watch batteries. She examined the map through spectacles with pale blue rims. "My grandmother called that place the 12 Trees," she said, touching Vale's garden. "I had not thought of it for years." Thomas and Ruth exchanged a glance. "You remember it?" Ruth asked. "Only the edge of it. There was a gate behind Weaver's Row, quite hidden by ivy. We children were told not to go in because the walls had become unsafe, but we reached through the bars for apples, small green things, sharp enough to make your eyes water." Edith smiled at the memory. One tree flowered after all the others. Sometimes it did not blossom until June. My grandmother said the clockmaker planted it so Bellweather would always have one last spring morning to look forward to. Ruth showed her the 5th symbol, the spool of thread. Anne Moss. Could she have been one of your family? Edith studied the name in the directory. There were Mosses in Weaver's Row for a very long time. My grandmother kept a brass counter in her sewing box with a reel engraved upon it. I assumed it belonged to an old game. She telephoned her daughter, who still had the sewing box. Less than an hour later, a small parcel arrived from the other side of the village. Inside was a brass disc marked V. The discovery changed the nature of their search. Not every piece had remained at its original landmark. Some had travelled quietly through families, mistaken for counters, keepsakes, or bits of old machinery. Edith also remembered the garden's location. Weaver's Row had been replaced by houses called Vale Cottages, although few residents knew why. A narrow service path still ran behind them. "The gate may be there," she said, "unless the hedge has swallowed it entirely." The rain had softened to a mist. Thomas closed the shop early, which caused the grocer across the square to look up in surprise.
Ruth borrowed 2 walking sticks from the library's lost property cupboard, and Edith insisted on accompanying them as far as the end of the lane. Vale Cottages stood east of the tower, just where Clockmaker's Walk appeared on the map. Between the last house and a high stone wall was a passage barely wide enough for one person. They followed it past dustbins, dripping rosemary bushes, and a shed roof shining with rain. At the end, behind an enormous tangle of ivy, Thomas felt cold iron. Ruth pulled one strand aside. Rainwater fell from the disturbed leaves, and the scent of wet earth rose from the ground beyond the wall. There was the curve of a gate. At its centre, beneath leaves and rust, 12 small circles surrounded the shape of an open hand.
The gate was locked, although its chain had rusted into something resembling a length of brown rope. Thomas did not wish to force it. The garden might have been forgotten, but forgotten did not mean ownerless. Ruth returned to the library to examine the property register, while Thomas telephoned the parish clerk. Edith waited beneath a neighbour's porch and supplied the names of 3 people who might remember the last owner of Vale Cottages. By the following morning, the answer had emerged. The strip of land behind the wall belonged to the parish, transferred to it in 1924, after the clockmaker's workshop was declared unsafe. The papers referred to it as Store Yard B. No plan mentioned a garden, and no one at the parish office could remember a key. Samuel Beck arrived, carrying bolt cutters, oil, and the solemn expression of a man about to undertake an important official duty. After receiving permission from the clerk, he worked the old chain loose without damaging the gate. It opened inward by 6 inches and stopped against the earth. The 4 of them pushed gently. Leaves shifted. Ivy tightened and released. With a long, low creak, the gate moved wide enough for them to enter. Vale's garden had not vanished. It had simply grown inward. The surrounding wall sheltered it from the wind, and years of fallen leaves had made the ground deep and soft. Ferns covered what had once been paths. Brambles leaned over stone borders. At the far end stood the dark outline of a small roofless workshop, its chimney remaining above walls threaded with ivy. And around the garden, in no obvious order, were old apple trees. Not 12, Thomas counted 7 still living. Their trunks were hollow in places, and their branches crossed like patient hands, but small apples remained among the leaves. Edith moved to the nearest tree and rested her palm against its bark. "This is the sharp one," she said. "I would know those apples anywhere." Thomas unfolded the map. The arrangement of the trees had changed, yet the outline of the wall was unmistakable. A circular space at the centre corresponded to a patch of nettles and long grass. Samuel found the remains of a gravel path beneath them. Ruth discovered fragments of blue and white tile around an old flower bed.
Near the roofless workshop, Thomas saw a stone carved with the familiar open hand. Below it were the words, "E. Vale, time for the raising." There was no 12th disc beside the carving, but a circular hollow showed where one had once rested. Thomas considered the phrase. Elias Vale had given his skill and his time. Perhaps Lydia had given the map and the written record. At the garden's centre, Samuel cleared the nettles with a hooked stick. Beneath them stood a sundial, green with moss and missing its metal pointer. Around its base were 12 empty circles, each exactly the size of the brass discs.
They did not place the discs into the sundial immediately. Only 5 had been found, and Thomas disliked asking an incomplete mechanism to perform a complete task. Instead, they spent the morning making the garden safe enough to explore. Samuel marked unstable stones with chalk. Ruth cut back nettles around the path. Edith sat upon an upturned bucket, directing operations and identifying plants that had survived from earlier gardens. Winter savoury, feverfew, a rose with small dark hips, and a patch of lavender growing almost beneath the wall. Thomas examined the ruined workshop. Its roof had fallen long ago, but one wall retained the outline of a fireplace. Rusted nails protruded from beams lying in the grass. Beneath a collapsed bench, he found fragments of clock cases, a cracked glass dial, and an iron clamp of a kind no longer commonly used. The place felt familiar despite its ruin. Light entered from the same direction as it did in his own shop. The workbench had faced the window. Small tools had once hung on the north wall. Elias Vale had probably stood there in the evenings while Sarah Breen's candles burned, and the parts supplied by his neighbours gradually became a clock. Ruth found a row of letters carved into the window ledge. MPLV JCEB AMRB GF SG WHEV. The contributors, she said, initials in the order of the hours. Using parish accounts and the trade directory, they completed several more names. The spool belonged to Anne Moss, the bell to Robert Bell, the feather to George Finch, the lantern to Sarah Green, the cartwheel to William Hart. The 10th symbol, a small clay jug, remained uncertain. The 11th was a needle. The 12th was the open hand of Elias Vale. Edith studied the list. "A jug," she said. "There used to be a pottery beside Clay Lane. The Marsh family ran it." Ruth found Rebecca Marsh in the directory. The needle belonged to Beatrice Gray, a seamstress who sewed the weather covers used while the clock faces were installed. All 12 names were known. Finding the remaining discs proved simpler once the village understood what they were. A notice in the library window requested information about old brass counters bearing pictures.
Before sunset, Robert Bell's disc arrived from a drawer in the vestry. George Finch's was found among printing blocks at the closed newspaper office. Sarah Green's had been made into a pendant and passed through 5 generations. The pieces returned one by one, not from secret chambers, but from ordinary cupboards and boxes. By the end of the week, 11 brass hours lay upon Thomas's green workbench. Only the open hand was missing, and without the 12th hour, the sundial in Vale's garden would not open whatever it had been made to keep.
Thomas examined the 11 discs beneath his magnifying lamp. Every one had a small notch and a narrow slot near its edge. When arranged in a circle according to the map, the slots pointed inward at different angles. He cut 11 paper copies and laid them over a drawing of the sundial. The empty space at 12 o'clock prevented the pattern from becoming clear. Ruth watched from the other side of the workbench while the shop settled into evening. Outside, the square was wet from another brief shower. Inside, the clocks measured the silence in soft, overlapping beats. "The hand belonged to Elias," she said. "Perhaps he kept it. The workshop has been searched. What about his other workshop?" Thomas looked up. Ruth nodded towards the tower. They returned the following morning. In the clock room, Thomas inspected every accessible surface of the original frame. Elias Vale's maker's mark appeared beneath the date, an open hand encircling the letter V. The same symbol had been stamped onto several gear wheels and engraved upon the pendulum bob. None concealed a disc. Ruth walked slowly around the mechanism. "The map was addressed to the keeper of the clock," she said. "Perhaps the final hour was meant to be found by the keeper alone." Thomas opened the eastern panel again. The shallow recess where the map had rested was empty, but the wooden panel itself deserved closer attention. Its inner surface contained scratches he had assumed were tool marks. They formed the outline of a hand. At its center was a screw unlike the others. Thomas turned it 1/4 to the left. A circular section of wood loosened beneath his thumb. Behind it lay the 12th brass disc. The open hand shone against his palm, protected from air and damp for 2 centuries. On its reverse was not the numeral 12, but a tiny engraved clock face showing 20 minutes past 4. Around the rim, where decoration might ordinarily have been placed, 12 fine lines met and separated like paths approaching a village square. "A time," Ruth said, "or an instruction." They carried the complete set to Vale's garden that afternoon. At the sundial, each disc settled neatly into its corresponding hollow. When the open hand was placed at 12, the inner slots formed a narrow arrow. It pointed towards the late flowering apple tree Edith remembered.
At 20 minutes past 4, the lowering sun reached over the western wall. The sundial lacked its metal gnomon, but the brass discs caught the light. 11 remained dull. The open hand reflected a small bright shape onto the tree's trunk. Thomas followed it. The light rested upon a scar in the bark, shaped like a crescent. Behind the tree, half buried in leaves, stood a low stone bench. Edith remembered sitting upon it as a child, although she had never known why the seat faced away from the finest view. Carved beneath its seat was a keyhole.
The keyhole was not designed for an ordinary key. It was round, with 12 shallow grooves around its edge. Thomas returned to the sundial and looked at the discs now resting in their hollows. When lifted and stacked in order, their outer notches formed 12 ridges. The overlapping pieces became a short brass cylinder, and the inward slots aligned to create a small open channel. "A key made of ours," Ruth said. Thomas inserted the stacked discs into the stone bench. They fitted with the gentle certainty of a lid meeting its proper box. He turned them clockwise. Something clicked inside the stone. The bench seat moved forward by less than an inch. Samuel and Thomas lifted it together, revealing a dry compartment lined with slate. Within lay a wooden case about the size of a large family Bible. The slate had kept the earth's dampness away, just as carefully as the tower recess had protected Lydia's map. It was made from oak, darkened by age, with brass corners and a simple clasp. No lock protected it. The 12-part key had already done its work. Ruth spread a clean cloth upon the grass. Thomas set the case on it and opened the lid. The first thing they saw was a bundle of letters tied with blue thread, matching the thread around the map. Beneath lay a ledger, a folded parchment, a narrow book of drawings, and a small drawstring bag that gave a muted metallic sound when moved. On top was a card addressed, "To Bellweather when 200 years have passed." Ruth read it aloud. "If the clock still keeps the hour, then the hands of our neighbours have endured within it. We ask only that their names be spoken once more, and that this garden, made for rest after labour, be opened again to those who raised the tower's heart." Signed beneath were Elias Whale and Lydia Whale. The parchment was a deed recording the gift of Whale's garden to the people of Bellweather, to be maintained as an orchard and quiet place. It bore 12 signatures and the seal of the parish, but apparently had never been entered into later registers under its proper name. The ledger contained every contribution to the clock. Some had given materials, others had given pennies, meals, transport, or hours of work. Sir Matthew's donation was the largest, but the final page was headed "The Whole Raising" and listed all 12 equally. Thomas opened the drawstring bag.
Inside were bundles of apple pips, sealed in tiny folded papers, each labelled with the name of one of the original trees. They would no longer grow after 2 centuries, but they had not been kept for planting. They were a record of what had stood there. Edith picked up one packet marked Late Blossom. "That tree is still with us," she said. Above them, its leaves moved softly in the afternoon air.
They carried the case to the library, where Ruth prepared the long oak table with clean cloths and unbleached paper. The windows were closed against dust. Mrs. Price brought tea, but for once did not lean over the documents until Ruth invited her. The letters had been written by the 12 contributors during the summer of 1826. They were not formal accounts, they were messages to future villagers. Martha Price wrote that the bread sent to the workers was slightly overbaked on the first day because she had been too interested in watching the tower crane. June Cooper complained cheerfully that Elias changed the dimensions of an iron bracket 3 times. Sarah Green described carrying candles to the workshop through warm June rain and finding the clockmaker asleep at his bench with a gear wheel beneath his cheek. Anne Moss had twisted and waxed the cords used to lift tools inside the tower. Robert Bell had tested the new striking hammer and declared it too loud, then too quiet, then acceptable. George Finch printed notices asking each household to contribute what it could, even if what it could offer was only an hour. William Hart's cart had become stuck in Mill Meadow while transporting the oak. Half the village came to push it free. The letters made the construction of the clock feel less like a piece of history and more like a long-remembered afternoon. Thomas could almost hear the voices in Elias Vale's workshop, disagreements about brackets, the scrape of timber, cups being put down among tools, someone laughing when the first bell sounded at the wrong hour. The final 2 letters were from Elias and Lydia. Elias described the mechanism in affectionate detail, but his purpose was simple. A village clock, he wrote, should not belong only to the person wealthy enough to commission its tower. It belonged to every person who arranged a day beneath it. Lydia's letter explained the map. Official plaques, she feared, remembered grand gestures more easily than small ones. The map would preserve the quieter contributions until the clock's bicentenary. The brass hours had been given to families, buildings and institutions, so the village would need to gather them again. No single keeper could open the garden alone. Thomas paused after reading that line. For most of his life he had thought of clockmaking as solitary work. 1 pair of hands, 1 bench, 1 mechanism patiently understood. Yet his shop depended upon Mrs. Price's daily bun, Ruth's records, Samuel's tower keys, and every customer who trusted him with an object that mattered.
Ruth unfolded Lydia's last page. There was one more request. When the 12 names had been restored and the garden opened, the keeper of the clock was to draw a new map of Bellweather, showing the people who kept the village's hours in their own time. Then the new map was to be hidden behind the eastern clock face for the keeper who would climb the tower 200 years later.
The news was shared with Bellweather at a meeting in the old town hall. Every chair was taken. People stood along the walls beneath the clock tower whose inner history had brought them there. Ruth displayed copies of the map and letters while the originals remained safely at the library. Mrs. Price sat in the front row beside Edith Moss, each wearing the expression of someone who had contributed materially to events and intended that this be understood. Thomas had been asked to explain the clock. He brought the wooden tally, curl of oak, and 12 brass discs. One by one he placed the hours in a circle upon a dark cloth and spoke the contributor's name that belonged to each. Martha Price, Lydia Vale, John Cooper, Edmund Brown, Anne Moss, Robert Beale, George Finch, Sarah Green, William Hart, Rebecca March, Beatrice Gray, Elias Vale. The room was quiet when he finished. Several villagers recognized family names. Others recognized names from roads, cottages, and memorial benches without knowing who the people had been. The parish clerk explained that the newly discovered deed would be reviewed and properly entered into the village records. More importantly, the council had already agreed to restore the land under its intended name, Vale's Garden and the 12 Trees. No one objected. Ideas came from every side. The gardening club would clear the paths. The school could help plant replacement apple trees. Samuel volunteered to repair the gate. Mrs. Price offered refreshments for the workdays, then added that this did not give people permission to step into her bakery wearing muddy boots. Ruth described Lydia's request for a new map. It must show the people who keep Bellweather's hours now, she said, not simply officials or names already written upon plaques. She placed a blank sheet beside the old map so everyone could imagine what their own version might contain. That question produced a thoughtful silence. Who kept the village's hours? The baker who lit her ovens before dawn? The nurse who drove to early visits? The school caretaker who opened the gates? The bus driver who waited when he saw someone hurrying down the lane? The volunteers who delivered library books to people unable to walk into the square? The meeting decided that every household could nominate one small act that helped Bellweather move gently through its days. Ruth would gather them, and Thomas would draw the new map. He had not drawn anything more ambitious than a gear diagram in years, but he agreed. As the meeting ended, a young woman remained beside the display. Her name was Sophie Hart, and she had recently returned to Bellweather after studying engineering. She held the curl of oak carefully. "Mr. Wren," she said, "would you show me where this piece belonged in the clock?" Thomas looked at her curious, attentive expression. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "if you do not mind 93 steps." Vale's garden changed slowly, which was the proper way for an old garden to change. On the first Saturday, volunteers cleared only the main path and removed branches that Samuel had marked unsafe. On the second, they uncovered the circular beds shown on Lydia's map. On the third, the gardening club pruned the surviving apple trees with such deliberation that each cut was discussed by at least 4 people. The village did not attempt to make the place look new. Moss remained upon the wall. Ferns remained beside the workshop stones. The old flower borders were allowed to keep their softened edges. Mrs. Price established a table near the gate with tea, buns, and strict instructions regarding the return of cups. Edith Moss sat beneath the late flowering tree, telling children how the sharp green apples had once been reached through the bars. Thomas worked on the new map at a small table in his shop. He began with the river and Market Square, copying Lydia's gentle lines without imitating them exactly. Around the edges, instead of 12 symbols, he left spaces for many. Nominations arrived on folded cards. A lantern represented the crossing patrol who stood outside the school in winter darkness. A soup bowl marked the community kitchen. A bicycle belonged to the postman who knew which garden gates stuck in damp weather. A pair of knitting needles represented 3 women who made blankets for the hospital. A small paw print was suggested for Mr. Oliver, who walked the dogs of 2 neighbours while they recovered from illness. Not all the acts were practical. One card nominated the person who planted bulbs beside the bus shelter without telling anyone. Another nominated a boy who played his violin beside an open window on Sunday afternoons. Someone suggested Ruth's pencil because the library always seemed to contain the answer to a question if Ruth was given enough time. For Thomas, the village nominated a tiny clock key. He pretended to find this unnecessary and drew it with particular care. Sophie Hart began spending mornings at his workbench. She had quick hands, but did not rush them. When Thomas showed her how to dismantle a carriage clock, she arranged each screw in a straight line and asked why the smallest wheel was made from brass rather than steel. He found himself explaining not only how, but why. Together they climbed the tower to inspect the oak shock pieces. Sophie noticed a hairline crack in one bearing bracket that Thomas had planned to examine next spring. They removed it, repaired it in the shop, and returned it before the clock lost a single minute. For years Thomas had assumed that when he stopped working, the shop would become something else,
perhaps a gallery or another tea-room. Now, listening to Sophie file the edge of a brass plate with slow, even strokes, he began to imagine a different future.
By early spring, Vale's garden was ready to open. 5 young apple trees had been planted where the map showed missing members of the original 12. The village chose old English varieties, russets, pearmains, and one late flowering tree grafted from the survivor Edith remembered. Samuel repaired the iron gate and painted it a deep, quiet green. At its centre he preserved the open hand and 12 circles, cleaning the metal without removing every mark of age. The roofless workshop became a sheltered seating place. A simple timber frame followed the outline of the former roof, but remained open to the sky. Thomas donated Elias Vale's surviving iron clamp, mounting it beside a small explanation of the clock's construction. The stone bench continued to guard the original compartment, although the letters and deed were now held in proper archival conditions. Inside the bench, Ruth placed copies for future visitors. Thomas completed the new map. It contained more symbols than he had expected. They spread beyond the village centre to farms, cottages, and the newer houses across the river. Their paths crossed and joined until the map resembled a piece of fine lace laid over Bellweather. At the centre he drew the clock tower. Around it he wrote, "The hours are kept by all who give them." Ruth read the sentence twice and nodded. Lydia would have approved. The opening took place on a mild Saturday afternoon. There was no ribbon. Edith said ribbons were attractive but impractical in a gateway already crowded with people. Instead, she opened the green gate and walked through first, carrying a small basket of apple blossom cut from the late tree. Children followed the gravel path, counting the 12 tree markers. Older villagers found names they recognized on the workshop display. Mrs. Price served buns made from Martha Price's old recipe, or as close to it as family memory allowed. At 4:20, sunlight crossed the sundial. The brass discs were displayed in the library, but Thomas had made 12 plain replicas for the garden. When their slots aligned, the bright arrow pointed once again towards the late flowering tree. For a few seconds the reflected light trembled upon the bark as leaves moved overhead. Then it steadied exactly above the bench, and several children whispered as though the garden itself had answered them. Sophie stood beside him. "Do you think Elias knew the light would still fall in the right place after 200 years?" Thomas considered the altered trees, repaired walls, and generations of buildings between the garden and the horizon. "Not exactly," he said, "but a good clockmaker allows for adjustment." From the square, the tower struck the quarter hour. Its sound crossed the rooftops and entered the garden, where people paused to listen. The chime seemed neither old nor new. It simply belonged there. The following Monday, before the square became busy, Thomas, Ruth, and Sophie carried the new map
up the 93 tower steps. Ruth brought a packet of letters written by Bellweather residents. Mrs. Price had described the bakery before sunrise. Samuel had written about opening the town hall after snow. Edith had recorded everything she remembered of the 12 trees, including the sourness of their apples. Sophie contributed a drawing of the clock movement as it appeared now, noting each alteration made since 1826. Thomas wrote a short account of finding Lydia's map and added the names of the 12 original contributors. They placed the papers inside an archival envelope. Around it, Thomas tied a new blue thread. The eastern access panel was open. Behind it, the clock continued steadily, its wheels moving with the quiet purpose of a mechanism doing exactly what it had been made to do. Thomas looked into the shallow stone recess. "It seems a little bare for 200 years," Sophie said. Ruth produced a pressed apple blossom from between the pages of a book. "Then we shall give them spring." She slipped it into a small protective sleeve and added it to the envelope. Thomas placed the bundle inside the recess. He had made a new inner cover of seasoned oak, copying Elias's hidden compartment, while leaving a clear note in the maintenance records so future repairs would not destroy it accidentally. On the cover he carved an open hand beside the year 2226. Before replacing the panel, he added one final object, an ordinary brass watch key from his shop. "What is that for?" Ruth asked. "So the next keeper has something to wonder about." He tightened the screws and checked the rod alignment. Sophie watched each movement, then repeated the inspection under his supervision. At 10 o'clock, the three of them stood beside the mechanism while the striking train lifted. The room was cool despite the spring morning, and sunlight from the eastern face lay in pale squares across the old timber floor. The first bell sounded through the room, deep and close. Ruth rested one hand upon the stone wall. Sophie watched the hammer mechanism. Thomas listened for the old hesitation between the third and fourth chimes. It did not come. The clock struck 10 evenly, allowing every note its full space. On the way down, Thomas stopped at the halfway landing. Through the narrow window he could see Vale's garden beyond the roofs. The new trees were only thin lines, but the old ones formed a soft green circle around them. 93 steps, Sophie said from below, unless the landing counts. Thomas looked at her. "It has never counted." "Why not?" "Because my father said it did not." Sophie considered this with appropriate seriousness. "Perhaps," she said, "that is another piece of history we should inspect." Ruth laughed, and Thomas, after a moment, agreed that perhaps it was.
Summer settled gently over Bellweather. The new apple trees held their leaves well. Lavender returned along the garden wall.
and the old late-flowering tree produced a modest crop of sharp green apples that Mrs. Price promised to turn into something edible with enough sugar. Vale's garden became part of the village again. People crossed it on their way home from the square. Library readers sat beneath the trees. Children traced the brass circles on the gate and learned that a clock could be raised with bread, paper, iron, candles, timber, and time. Thomas no longer worked every day. On Wednesdays he closed the shop after lunch and walked with Ruth along the river. On Friday mornings Sophie joined him at the bench. A new line appeared beneath T.W. Wren on the window in smaller gold letters. S. Hart, Clock Repair and Restoration. Thomas said the spacing required improvement. Sophie said it would remain exactly as it was until he admitted the landing counted as a step. Neither appeared eager to settle the matter. One evening, after the shops had closed, Thomas carried 2 cups of tea into Vale's garden. Ruth was sitting on the stone bench with Lydia's map reproduced in a book upon her lap. The market square could not be seen from there, but the top of the clock tower rose above the roofs. Its eastern face had caught the last of the sunlight. Thomas sat beside her. For a while they said nothing. The village moved quietly beyond the wall, a gate closing, a bicycle passing along the lane, the faint clatter of cups being put away in the tea shop. Swallows turned above the tower. At 8 the clock began to strike. The first note crossed the roofs and entered the garden, then the second. The sound was familiar, but Thomas heard more within it now. He imagined Martha's bread cooling beside the workers, Lydia's paper spread across a desk, John's iron brackets and Edmund's oak. He imagined candlelight in the workshop and 12 neighbours bringing what they could. The 8th note faded into the warm evening. "Do you think the map will last another 200 years?" Ruth asked. "The paper may," Thomas said. "The clock will need attention. Fortunately, it has a keeper." Thomas looked towards the tower and then at the new trees around the garden. He thought of Sophie at the workbench, Samuel's repaired gate, Edith's remembered apple, and all the symbols crossing the new map. "More than one," he said. The light slowly left the clock face. One by one lamps appeared behind the village windows. Vale's garden grew quiet beneath its 12 trees, holding the day's last warmth in its walls. Above Bellweather, the old clock continued steadily. Tick by patient tick, it kept no single person's time. It kept the hours they had made together.